I'm Chad Harvey, and this is AI for the C-Suite, the show for senior leaders who know AI matters and need to figure out what to do about it. Each episode, we dig into what it all actually means for mid-market organizations, how it's changing decisions, strategy, leadership, and the nature of work. Let's get into it. My guest today has spent his whole career on the unglamorous half of tech, the part that nobody puts in the keynote. Justin Watts started out in large-scale project management at IBM, then spent nearly 8 years at MetaLab, the product studio that helped design Slack. When there, he shipped work for companies like Uber and Amazon, and eventually ran ops. These days, he's the co-founder of Switchboard, where he and his team build the internal software and AI automation that growing companies just can't buy off the shelf. And here's why he's here today. Everybody's chasing shiny AI tools, yet Justin spends his days on the thing underneath all of it, your data, your processes, the plumbing. He's got a great way of putting it. Most companies are trying to run multiplayer AI on a single player setup, and we're going to dig into that first. So as we get into it, Justin, welcome to AI for the C-Suite.
What a tee up. Thanks, Chad. Good to be here.
Absolutely. So I deliberately put that line in your introduction here because you and I had some conversation before the episode today, and I love the way you phrased it. You said that single player versus multiplayer AI is what's going on out there right now. And I want you to walk us through what you mean when you say single player versus multiplayer AI. Walk us through that distinction. What's it mean for organization? And why is it the thing that is quietly deciding whether AI initiatives are actually working or not?
Yeah, I think a lot of teams view AI still as what it launched as, which is a chat box sitting there for one person to plug whatever they want into and use whatever they get back from it. And so that is wonderful and all, but that's not how businesses work. And so the thing I'm seeing execs and leaders grasp is, if I can do this, how does my team do this? And a chat box is not the answer to that. If to overly simplify, if a business is an assembly line of process and, steps 1, 4, and 9 are done by one person, steps 2, 6, and 12 are done by someone else, and then there's a step in between where you got to send an email to chase something, and then some other step you're plugging something into a spreadsheet somewhere. As you can probably imagine, AI is not built to magically know which step is active right now, who needs to do what and when. And so businesses who are saying, we want AI and viewing it as this magical silver bullet through the lens of a chat box, and that's all they're used to, are quickly becoming disenchanted with how AI works in their business because they're not looking at it in that multiplayer way, just like video game equivalent of, you're playing Tomb Raider or Mario. It's you playing Mario and you're going through each level by yourself. Is very different than Fortnite or Roblox, as some folks may play themselves or their kids play. Like, it's them with 100 other people doing something together. And that's how business operates. And AI needs to be thought of that way, as in, how do we have steps 1, 3, and 6 done by one person and steps 2, 5, and 12 by someone else? Process-wise, have their AI kind of working together that way. So that's a bit of a ramble of a tee up to it. We can go down any of those rabbit holes I probably just opened up, but that's how I frame it to folks to think about.
No, I think that's a good framing, and it makes me wonder whether that makes this podcast the equivalent of people that watch other people playing video games. I don't know. So, all right,
be that as itself. Twitch is a multi-billion-dollar company.
It certainly is. All right, so let's go in here. How does that land when you have an executive who thinks that they're already using AI, but it's really single player mode, like you've described? Is that a difficult conversation? Is that an aha moment? Is it a variety of reactions?
It's usually a difficult conversation that leads to an aha moment. As in, a use case for a lot of people is whatever their business might be. Let's say professional services of some shape or form. They have someone who starts out as a lead. That lead becomes a client or a customer who's getting a service or a product. That service or product is fulfilled, and then there's a financial transaction for that. All of those different steps, the hard part of the conversation usually is, what does it look like to do those? What does your data look like? Do you have a CRM that calls the customer one thing and a financial system that's disconnected from the CRM calling the customer something different? Do you have 9 spreadsheets in between for all the people fulfilling the service or the product to keep track of whatever customer support needs versus operations versus sales, whatever that might be? That's usually the hard part of the conversation is, well, how can you point AI at what's the status of this customer when the customer lives in 6 different systems that aren't disconnected? They're called 4 different things, might be a legal name in one system, a shorthand in another, their public name in another, whatever it looks like. The hard part is to deduce, is your data ready for AI? Because AI will get very confused very quickly if you say, what's the status of Chad Harvey Inc., but Chad is spelled 6 different ways in 6 different places. So that's usually what leads to the aha moment of, well, you can't just point AI at spreadsheets that live on people's local computers, process that lives in people's heads and has never been documented, or 5 systems where half the people's job are just repeating information between these systems because they're not connected. So once you climb that mountain and have that aha moment, it then becomes very easy to see, okay, well, if we get our data in order, it actually becomes pretty quick to install, so to speak, AI in our company, because you're not spending all your time jerry-rigging these workarounds and nuances that you have to bake in to say, well, when we say this, we mean look at that system. When we say this, we mean that kind of service. If everything is consistent and connected data-wise, AI starts to become a lot easier to adopt and implement. And really what the goal is to see an actual ROI and benefit out of it.
One ring to rule them all. Yes.
Yes.
This is fascinating because I'm always very intrigued when someone has a conversation with me and we touch on all these different pieces, because you're talking about business processes, you're talking about data integrity, you're talking about multiple systems, then we're talking about AI. And I'm wondering, when you walk into an organization, do you ever find that it is just simply more than you can handle because they don't have their processes mapped? They've got the multiple systems with the different kind of form fields that you're talking about where the same data is called different things. How do you know when that possible engagement that you've been thinking about is just that rarest of materials? It's unobtainium, right? How do you know that when you walk in there, and where do you draw the line?
Yeah, the conversation I often have with execs is like, what is the surface area where you want AI? Is there a problem child in your business of a department or a team where it's like, you know, that if you doubled in revenue, you'd have to double the headcount because it's just such mayhem and not driven by any sort of formal process, technology, data, et cetera? Or are you looking for a complete reinvention of how the business operates? Or is there kind of a few bottleneck areas that you want to focus on? That's why I try to dissuade people from the notion of like, we want to reinvent the business as quickly as possible, because very few are prepared to do that. We are helping a couple teams do that right now, but it is not a 3-month, quick win mini project. It is a year-long effort to turn process in people's heads and data scattered across different places and tools that don't talk to each other into a cohesive system with a cohesive process throughout. That requires effort. And so for that reason, to answer your question more plainly, it really depends on that surface area. What do you want to change in your business? If it's everything, then we can do that, but are you ready for it?
Right.
And inversely, usually I'm not trying to, pitch some grand transformation project. People want to see wins in months and quarters, not years and years. So that's how I approach it.
And what you just described, I cannot remember the name of the model, but there's a pyramid model with 3 levels where it talks about transformation at the top, where almost nobody is yet. And then we've got cost savings and dramatic increases in efficiency at kind of those bottom 2 pyramid levels. And what I wonder is, as we begin to move into a more sophisticated approach to AI, which you are clearly taking with your clients, do you feel that many of them will stop at the efficiency and the cost savings that they are achieving through these implementations? Or do you think that some will eventually become ready for that true transformation that you talked about there? Because I see the potential with a lot of what's being the train tracks, if you will, that are being laid down right now for massive transformative efforts for organizations. But I'm not sure that the appetite is actually there.
Yeah, I think we're seeing 2 things play out right now, or I'm in my experience with all the teams that we get the privilege of getting to see how they're approaching it and what we get to do together. I'm seeing 2 things play out. One is the technology is just inherently getting better, and these things are getting easier and easier to do. As in the transformation itself, you don't have to put as much guardrails and harnessing around the models because the models themselves are getting so capable. Right. So I think just the natural technological progression, which is why if you think back to the digital transformation era, it was a huge lift, both financially and time wise, to go from email on a server in your closet to in the cloud. And now anyone can spin up a Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace account in 2 minutes. So the technology part is getting better. But the thing that has stood out to me for teams wanting just the short-term ROI benefits versus those who are rethinking and transforming their entire business is historically every era of digital transformation has been if you get on board, you get some benefits, but if you don't, it's just a margin hit. So it's kind of not opting into getting your file server out of the closet into the cloud was a tax on your business. It was, I'm maybe making 5, 10, 15% less margin, but my competitors that didn't do that either are also fine with, spreadsheets that I have to VPN into a server in a closet. So it used to be a tax, but now it's become a countdown. If you're not willing to transform, we're seeing teams start from day one competing with businesses that have been around for 20 years, and they are within a year approaching the same capabilities with 25 people as a business of 250 people. So to avoid the transformation era of digital transformation, cloud transformation, et cetera, that might have been a tax, but now it's becoming a countdown where if you don't participate, then you're going to get run out of business. And that's not trying to be fear-mongering or the snake oil of AI will solve everything. It won't. But it presents an opportunity to completely change how a business operates and becomes more efficient. So I think right now it's totally fine if teams are just looking for that first rung or two on the ladder, as you mentioned, but that rung 3, if that's true transformation of the business process and model and operational infrastructure in 3 or 4 years, people are going to have no choice.
I appreciate how you couched your remarks against the idea of fear mongering. And I absolutely love the idea of a tax versus a countdown. I think that's a very stark visual that should drive it home for a lot of people. And I agree that we are in an era here where you need to take the longer term, and by longer term, it could be even 5 or 10 years, as opposed to 15 or 20 implications of this very seriously. So I really like that. I haven't heard anybody phrase it quite that way in terms of a tax versus a countdown. So kudos to you for that little visual there.
If I can add one more, the way I've thought about it as well, more visually or anecdotally, if it drives it home for people more, is anytime you see a montage in a movie, if you picture Rocky punching the punching bag, running up the stairs in his tracksuit, like you could pay to have that done for you previously. You could pay a consultant to come in and say, hey, we want to move our email to the cloud, whatever it might be. This era, you can't pay for the montage. You have to put in the work to transform your business because it's not just a switch that flips and suddenly things are transformed. You actually have to reinvent the business kind of top down and bottom up. It's a grassroots level because obviously there's many folks scared for the impacts to their job. But so far, we've not seen jobs being eliminated. It's that people are creating new jobs within businesses because of the time that they're freed up from. Everyone grew up with the dream of astronaut, doctor, lawyer. No one grew up with the dream of, I want to move cells around spreadsheets and reply to Roy in accounting for the 9th time to chase an invoice status. So the montage you used to be able to pay for, but you can't really pay for it anymore.
Yeah, fair enough. And my dream was kind of just the first part. It was the astronaut part, but I'm also still salty. I've said this before. I never got my flying car. I was promised a flying car and jetpacks when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Where are they?
Yeah, Jetsons. Come on, you lied to us.
Exactly. All right. Let me circle back real quick to where we started because I don't want to completely drive by because we got into some great stuff, but I don't want to completely drive by your single player versus multiplayer. I had 1 or 2 other questions there. What point do you think a company crosses into multiplayer levels, and is that a danger zone?
It is a danger zone if you treat it as the Wild West. So a lot of times, like if you picture a sales team, there's, let's call it a 10-person sales team in a business. There might be a playbook of generally this is, the point at which we do discovery, and this is how we do discovery, and this is how we build a proposal and how we close the business and kick it off. But very rarely will all 10 of those people have the exact same process for how they get there. And so that's where it starts to turn into the Wild West, where I've seen some teams just say, hey, here's the equivalent of a 16-year-old with a learner's permit. You just give them the keys to the car and say good luck. Instead, what is successful is we're going to take you and show you how to parallel park and shoulder check and use your blinkers and whatnot, and giving those guardrails to a team where A, you're not letting it be the Wild West, as in there's now 6 AI agents all trying to do the same thing differently, then you're back to square one of what are we doing here if we're still, all in silos, that single player experience. And B, we're all working towards the same thing, which is to take the work off of our plates, not just speed up little parts. It's, that entire proposal process. If you've got a good transcript from a call and you've got the context of what a good proposal looks like, the proposal is written for you. And yes, you as a human still need to be in the loop to review it and whatnot. But letting it be the Wild West is where I see teams get frustrated at their progress because they never really gave themselves guardrails to say, yes, there's 10 people on this team, but it doesn't mean we should have 10 people building their own AI system. It should be that single system for a multiplayer environment.
I think that's a really fair point. And when you say Wild West, I think something that often comes to my mind too, and I'm segueing here a little bit, but one of the things that I often think of is what you touched on earlier in our conversation, companies where everything's a spreadsheet, right? So we've got that kind of as the Wild West over here. And then on the other side, we've got overstructured shops that are living on these big enterprise platforms. And I'm sure that you've seen both. And I'm sure that there are benefits and drawbacks to both. So maybe we can spend a little time talking about that as well, because this idea of mid-market being more nimble and being able to move faster, I think is legitimate in many ways. However, there's a lot more Wild Westing that's going on with those types of organizations. So with all that in mind, I don't know. There was a question in there somewhere. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I think of most people don't realize Excel came out the same year that the movie Back to the Future did. That's how old that product is. I know. It makes me feel old. But my point being of yes, Excel has stood the test of time for good reason because it is so flexible and it's easy to understand. The drawback is most businesses run on it without a realization of how much they're holding themselves back by this notion of our operating system is an Excel model or an Excel spreadsheet that gets passed around and synced between 10 people, but they're still spending most of their day just filling out fields. What if you could have all of that filled out for you? And what if the process was invisible for getting there? The custom software side that's what's fascinating to watch is the mental math used to be, well, if I want to build something that replaces Excel, it's either some sort of SaaS off the shelf, which most people are increasingly repelled from because the SaaS model is meant to be seat-based pricing and gets expensive, but more so, it's never built for you. It's built for lowest common denominator of how many businesses can we get to sign up. But on the flip side, building custom software for yourself used to be, call it 18 months, 5 developers, and $750,000. The mental math for that is very quickly changing where, it's easy to have a conversation about, well, you can replace this with a whole, call it operating system for your company that does a lot of your process for you, has actual features that help you do your work instead of updating 19 formulas a week to make it work again. And that mental math is becoming easy because what used to be 18 months and 5 developers is 4 months and 2 developers. Mm-hmm. So I encourage everyone, maybe as something more actionable than pontificating to folks, is take an Excel spreadsheet that your business runs on, throw it into Claude or ChatGPT and say, is this a candidate for a product that would help us internally? Mm. If so, what would that look like? What features would it have? How would we use it? Spending that 20 minutes doing that, I've encouraged many folks to do that as a means to their early days. They're not ready to work with us, for an example. And I say, just try this then. And they come back and go, oh, we didn't realize we are running this business so inefficiently because it's 4 spreadsheets duct taped together and we could have one system that does a lot of this for us. So as an actionable thing, just try that with Claude or ChatGPT one day.
Yeah, I love it. That's a great suggestion. So let's talk about the other side of the equation, the big enterprise platforms, right? You kind of touched on that a little bit and talked about SaaS. When you've got an overstructured shop that's using one of these big ERP systems or one of these big SaaS platform systems, is that difficult in a different way for you to work with the clients? What do you see there?
It's better in that the data is usually more structured and you can get to AI faster because you're not pointing it at a bunch of people's C drives that you're hoping they updated something that day on their computer. So in that way, it's better on the data side. Where the drawback happens is the process. So the flexibility of something like Excel allows you to do kind of whatever you want with it. On the flip side, these giant organizations they need to make sure that their software works for everyone. So if you say, could we have this feature? Could we change how that works? They're going to, usually the answer is, yeah, we'll put it on the roadmap. That's a good idea. And you never hear from them again.
Mm-hmm.
So the rigidity of those platforms is inherent in the business model if they're trying to appeal to as many folks as possible. The drawback for each business that uses it is if it doesn't work for you, there's not much more you can do with it. And so that's where people are, again, kind of that custom stuff. If you think about the middle ground of it built for you off the shelf perfectly, or an Excel model that you've jerry-rigged, if that custom software is somewhere in the middle, then that tends to also be the answer to that. Because again, it's becoming clear napkin math to say, well, we're going to pay Salesforce 60 grand a year, or we can build something custom once for 100 grand and have no more ongoing costs other than a small amount of hosting, which is usually a hell of a lot less than seat-based costs. So it depends on what you need as a business. The one other thing I would add is a lot of SaaS companies are having that reckoning of, do we let others use our data? As in, everything in a business doesn't run out of one piece of software. It usually runs out of 5, 10, 15 pieces of software. And for every one piece of software that is incredibly flexible and lets you plug that piece of software into the rest of the ones that your business uses, there's always 5 that are saying, no, we're going to charge an arm and a leg for API access, or we're just not going to let you, because their goal is to keep you in their ecosystem and keep giving them money. But that, I think, ultimately is going to work against them, because people need that flexibility. There isn't one magical piece of software that every business can run on.
So you've raised a point there that I've seen in a variety of different ways, because you talked about kind of the multiple systems, and you talked about a number of different things there. And what I often find when I go into medium and larger organizations is they love to say that we have a source of truth, right? And what I find personally typically is that maybe one department or one functionality has a source of truth, but there's usually a dozen source of truths. What do you find when you walk in?
Yeah, it goes back to that earlier point that we were chatting about. The professional service business that has a lead that turns into a customer that gets something fulfilled for them. There's usually a bunch of spreadsheets, a bunch of tools where everyone says, oh, I know exactly who that customer is. But if you were to zoom out, view it as plane altitudes at the ground foot level, yes, everyone has their own source of truth. But if you were at 30,000 foot view as a plane, you would see 9 different neighborhoods with vastly different architecture of houses and no connecting roads to each other. I'm really into analogies today. Sorry.
I love it. We're going to have to retain an illustrator to insert some cartoons into this episode's videos. So.
Sold. Yeah. But that's kind of the way that most businesses operate. And so the thing that execs have to reckon with is, what actually is our source of truth, and who do we give the keys to? As in, does this become a engineering or IT function? Does this become one department to rule them all? To use your analogy from earlier, like, it's a hard decision to make, but in the absence of that, you go back to Wild West of, well, there is no decision made, therefore everyone does it their own way, and it's a hodgepodge.
So let's talk about the Wild West a little bit more, and let's change the names to protect the guilty. If you reflect back on companies that you've been working with over the last couple of years in this space, think about a company where you walked in and the data was a genuine mess. It was absolutely, it was horrible, as bad as it could get, because I'm sure you've been there. What did you find? What did you do? What actually changed for the company after you were done with them? And again, we don't need names. We'll protect the guilty here. But yeah, kind of channel that experience for us.
Yeah, as you're asking, that one that came to mind right away was, we had a team where they provide services for someone, and they grew very organically. And so, as is the case with most businesses, you keep an eye as a leader on the things that are breaking, and the things that seem like they're running along smoothly. You're just like, great, I won't pay attention to it. The thing they didn't pay attention to is, because they grew organically in a great way overall, was they hired all these account managers, and they had a rate card as a business, as in whatever service was being provided, we're going to quote them our rate. The thing that they never stopped to take a look at was, what are our rates? Are they consistent? And when we came in, they said, we want to automate our quoting, like our kind of cash to quote cycle. We want to automate the quoting and proposal creation, because our account managers spend endless hours a week kind of creating all of these for every request that comes in. So we said, great, let's take a look at the rate cards. Their rate cards were spread across, I think it was 9 spreadsheets, and were the equivalent, when we brought it all into one, was 14,000 rows in one spreadsheet. And this is like a mid-market business. This isn't, a manufacturing business with 91 types of sockets and 51 types of screws. Like, they had about 10 services, but somehow their rate card was the equivalent of 14,000 rows. And that's because the account management team had no guardrails and they grew organically. So they just said, I'll copy so-and-so spreadsheet and make it my own for my customers. And then they copied, and et cetera, et cetera. So as you can probably imagine, if a customer comes in and picks one of 10 services and says, I want to automate the quoting and proposal part, well, which rate do we pick when there's only 10 services, but 14,000 rows of rates? And so that's just one example of that absence of guardrails. If you view it as bowling, there was no bumpers on the bowling, and every time it could go into the gutter. How can you have automation and AI say, well, this is what we're going to charge them when there's 900 variations of one service, kind of thing? So that's just one extreme example of 10 services does not equate to 14,000 rows for a rate sheet.
Indeed. What was the timeline on when they started to see, I hate the phrase ROI, but I don't know what else to use. So how long did it take them to see a return on that investment in that work?
Well, we spent about 6 months together building all of that, because we had to your earlier point of the rungs of the transformation pyramid, so to speak. They were kind of forced into this transformation because the way that they did it couldn't sustain itself. Like, there was no process, and there was a 14,000 row rate card, et cetera. And so for them, it was about 6 months of both the business process mapping. And by that, I mean getting the right people in the room to say, from step 1 to step 10, how does it work? What are all the edge cases? Where does it go wrong? What do we need to factor in? And half of our job is just to get people in the room together to say, how does this work? Because, and why I say that's half the job, is usually getting them into the room and getting them to talk about their own process. They realize for themselves, like, how did we let this happen? Why does a 40-step process need to be 40 steps when logically, now that we're playing it out loud, it actually could be 20. And of those 20, 10 of them could be automated. So that ROI, to answer your question, was kind of that 6 months of us doing the mapping, getting all the data figured out, because the rate card example was one of 4 or 5 examples where how did it get this way? But that allowed us to build a consistent system and layer in automation and AI into it, so that at that 6-7 month mark, we could start to launch it to their team, and ROI came within, a few quarters, because they just save so much time. The way that I look at ROI of a lot of AI is, I've yet to see any revenue generating AI be successful, as I'm sure some people listening have tried. The AI SDR and the AI salesperson, like, they're all, in my opinion, largely terrible. But the operating side of the business is where you get the benefit. And so a lot of times the ROI, the way that I think about it with execs, and they come to learn is a good way to think about it, is like, how much could we grow and not have to raise headcount? As in, if our margin at 10 million is 10%, at 20 million it could actually be 25%, not just 20%, or whatever the math is for their business. But the time that you get back tends to equate to those people have more time for more important things. And if we doubled revenue, doesn't mean that we have to double headcount accordingly.
I think one of the themes that emerges in a lot of the conversations I've had with folks in spaces like yours or adjacent to yours that are working with clients around AI is that AI no longer allows you to hide the fact that your digital change management initiative failed. It doesn't allow you to hide the fact that your processes aren't documented and that they're a mess. It doesn't allow you to hide because your data is in 50,000 different places. And that's really what came through for me just now in your anecdote, again, is that we can't apply this technology unless those other things get addressed first.
Yeah, and that's the painful part. I think that's why when people say AI is going to take everyone's jobs and it's going to change every company over the next 18 months, I roll my eyes at this point, because human nature and the history of technological evolution indicates that is never going to be the case. Yes, the technology is progressing extremely quickly, and I still have jaw drop moments, every month at this point. It used to feel like every year, and then every quarter, and now it's every month.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change the fact that you could have all the advancement in the world tomorrow, but it takes a long time for humans to be comfortable with change, to be willing to change. And that is where most of our time is spent. Like I think McKinsey has the stat of like something like 65 or 70% of digital transformation projects fail. What they fail to include in that is about 90% of that is in the change management stage. You can build the coolest thing in the world, but if people don't understand it, both the benefit and the why of it and the how and the what, they're not going to adopt it. So as I think the AI, the tech bros have come to call it, of the technological overhang, as in the overhang of like the technology has progressed a lot more than people realize, but the ability for humans, which companies are just made up of humans working together, the ability of companies and therefore the people inside of them to change is going to be a lot slower than people think.
I've spoken with a number of change management experts on this show before, and worked with a number of others on overlapping engagements with clients. And the question I keep coming back to, which you just kind of teed up very nicely, and I don't expect an answer for this because it's a little bit more esoteric, but I wonder whether the companies that are born first and are AI first and are new to the market now, you touched on some of those earlier, I wonder whether they are going to outrun all of these other organizations, because you hit the nail on the head when you talked about people being the problem here and the change management component being a problem. And I wonder, can existing organizations change enough and change fast enough to outrun the competitors that are already spinning up right now?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, that's why I call it a countdown. Like it's unavoidable because we're already seeing it with, even in our space. Like we're not to talk about our shop. I'm not here to pitch what we do, but it still blows my mind when we share our prices and timeline, and there people are like, "There's no way you can do it at a good quality for that price and that timeline." I'm like, "Watch." And it's
Hold my
because,
beer.
yeah, and it's because we're not carrying the baggage of a Deloitte, McKinsey, Accenture. Half of people's week is spent in politics and a meeting about an email from 6 weeks ago. We are building everything as kind of AI first and keeping humans in the loop, but by nature of that, we're out competing those businesses and winning work because of that. And so I use that as a very personal anecdote, but I think we're seeing it in many spaces. I think tutoring, if people look at kind of the tutoring and education space, there's a lot of startups coming out of like Y Combinator that are surpassing the revenue at 25, 30 people of businesses that have been around, that they're competing with, who've been around for 20 years. And so it goes back to that countdown of, it's not to fearmonger. It's more of, yes, you can avoid making changes and transforming and preparing and diving into this era. And right now that's okay. But a couple of years from now, when more and more, to your point, companies start and are born out of this era, they inherently have the advantage of, they don't have the baggage of, so and so who's been here for 20 years and they've opted to run their department off a spreadsheet that only they know, and the 10 other people on their team have no idea how it works, is very different than someone who said, I get multiplayer AI and skills and harness this with AI, and we built our company around that from day one. They just inherently can outcompete you.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. Since we're touching on the issue of change here, I hear the phrase bandied about a lot, AI ready. And I'm sure you've walked into potential client meetings before and heard that phrase. What is the biggest misconception that execs have about being AI ready, and where do these smart leaders get this wrong?
I think the thing I've had to reckon with and get over my own resentments or chips on my shoulder, if I'm being honest, is I had the benefit of working only with tech startups and call it Silicon Valley companies for nearly a decade. And when you say API and you say agile and you say like all of these terms, that's just common language. It was a rude awakening working with everyone. Now working with every company, or every company we work with is not in Silicon Valley and doesn't come from tech. And so there was a bit of a chip on my shoulder of like, do you not get this? Like, do you not get why you should have data and tools connected and whatnot? And so that is kind of like the change part, the AI ready part. Is I really encourage leaders. My resentment has gone. I get it. Everyone is running their own business. We've got founders who know these niche businesses better than anyone, and someone from Silicon Valley thinks they can come in and take over. It's like, no, you don't get the nuance and requirements or compliance needs or whatever it might be. So there's many folks who they have every right to be successful in their business. What shocks me is their level of technical understanding is so low that the change and AI readiness, they don't even know what that looks like. So all that is to say, if the peak of technical performance in your company is someone that can build a pivot table, then you probably need some help on getting AI ready. And if the peak in your organization is we have a CRM and that's everything else is run out of spreadsheets, you probably need to be AI ready culturally more than you do technically, because the technical part is now pretty easy. We're building with tools that have been around for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It's the people side of it. So this is a bit of a, I'll get off my soapbox, but
No,
but
keep going. Let's put another soapbox on top of it.
the AI readiness part, if anything, that I encourage leaders to do is start playing around with this stuff. Start understanding it for yourselves, and not just taking the LinkedIn slop that is everything changed today and AI is here. There is no AI silver bullet. There is no one AI tool. There is no one AI model that will solve all of this for you. Being AI ready is more about a cultural readiness for change of how you do business and how you operate than it is a technical adoption. The technical adoption is part of it, but it's always going to fail if you're not ready culturally. And that starts at the top.
And I love those two succinct litmus tests that you threw out there in terms of how did you phrase it? If the peak of your technical prowess in your company is somebody who can build a pivot table, that's a problem, right? So not AI ready.
We've learned to ask folks when we're getting into a company that says we don't have a strategy and we're hiring you to help us figure out what is even our strategy. We send out a feeler of who are the most technically proficient, and it's always wonderful when they're like, oh, we have an engineering team, and chat with our VP of engineering and we hop right into a great conversation with them, or a CTO type. But most mid-market businesses don't have that kind of team, and so it's not a knock on them. None of this is meant as a slam. It's more so we ask to get introduced to those folks so we understand where they're at, and we quickly learn, oh yeah, you should chat with so and so. They understand technology, and we meet with them and we say, we hear you're the pro. We'd love to see what you've built. And they pull up an Excel sheet and they're like, I can use macros in Excel. And we're like, that's great. That's not a bad thing. But if that's your kind of pinnacle of technical ability in the organization, you are operating in a different era.
Well said. Well said. You touched on this before too. You kind of talked about some of the pitfalls with the classic strategy deck approach. I think you kind of channeled the specter of some of the big consulting companies, and the fact that instead of a 120-page report, you guys build something that people can see. And I'm interested in your perspective on why seeing it changes the conversation, and what should execs insist on being shown before they commit a real budget instead of a 120-page report or a really fancy slide deck. So again, my two questions here are basically, why does seeing it change the convo, and what should an exec insist on seeing before they even authorize a single dollar of spend?
Yeah, I don't take for granted that I was spoiled getting to work at a product design agency that got to work with the coolest startups and enterprise 100 or 10 even. And it was always fascinating to watch where, we had product management, we had projects being run really well. We had great UX research, we had great engineers, but the thing where the execs' eyes lit up, the founders' eyes lit up, and everyone really crystallized around what this thing is and how it is going to work and function was always in the design phase. That was always the most fun phase, because there's a very big difference between when contracts signed, spin up project management template, inform someone with a notification, do the checklist item for them, that kind of thing. There's a very big difference between that and watching someone press a button and seeing the template spin up and fill in automatically for you, and then a Teams channel spin up for you, and all that kind of stuff that automation does on paper. You can explain it, but there's a very big difference between this is what it would actually look like for you to be using it tomorrow. And so that's why we take the prototype first approach. And it, again, we're spoiled in this era, being born out of the AI era, of a prototype, because we're not building a complex backend and having to build all this infrastructure and worry about security and whatnot. It's non-functional and not using real data and whatnot. So we can spin it up in a week kind of thing. So a prototype really crystallizes the idea. And so to your point, that's kind of the what and why. To your question around like what execs should ask for is a prototype. Like, what will this actually look like if we were to roll this out tomorrow in our organization as a system, whether that's something as small as, call it a utility app where you drop in something and it automates something for you, all the way to we want an OS orchestration layer system for our business. Asking for a prototype is, I think, where people should start. And maybe I'm a bit biased, but having been through an era where you map out the workflow on paper and you're in a Visio or Miro type app and kind of figuring out what it is, when you actually get to building it, there's always way more change than you think there will be, because it's not until people actually see how they're going to use it that it clicks for them.
Yeah. I am personally very guilty of using jargon and driving by terms that I understand and my guests understand, but sometimes the listener does not. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you as a follow up was, what's the smallest version of something that a resource constrained company could try themselves? And you mentioned a utility app, and I'm thinking that that might be a good way for us to kind of explain what is a utility app, number one, and then number two, what's the smallest version of one of those that's most cost effective that you've seen that would demonstrate to a leader the potential and the possibility that you're speaking to right now?
Yeah, if you think about your business as Henry Ford era assembly line, and there's, call it 40 core steps or 40 core processes in your business that kind of follow an assembly line. Utility app is zooming in on 3 or 4 of those steps and building something that would solve for that. Again, to your earlier point of why folks kind of either are intimidated by or fail with these kind of AI rollouts and deployments and transformations, is because they try to boil the ocean and they want to solve for all 40 steps of the assembly line. And so we refer to it as a utility app, as in there's a utility provided to an area of the business, not orchestration of the entire business. And so a good example is a lot of businesses will get a request for a proposal. And so they'll get an email saying, we're looking for XYZ on ABC timeline, whatever the inputs might be. How do you build a utility that intakes that, looks at your, call it parameters internally, your matrix of services, cost, resourcing, whatever it might be, and automatically intake that and generate a first pass of the proposal and quote for them? That is a good example of a utility app. It's not solving for the entire sales cycle. It's solving for the utility of that proposal part that happens somewhere in, those 3 or 4 steps in that assembly line.
That's a perfect example, and I think it's a good springboard into the decision making process. So, in your hypothetical there, you talked about a 40-step process, right? Assuming that the data in an organization is in good enough shape, right, with those 40 steps. Let's just assume that. I know it's a big assumption, but let's assume that. Assuming the data is in good enough shape, how do you decide where AI actually belongs in a workflow like that versus where it's just a gimmick or hype?
Yeah, the thing I encourage folks to think about first and foremost, if it's call it the Eisenhower matrix of like cost or effort versus value, is what is the most repetitive and what involves the most people having to do it. So we have folks sometimes will come to us and they say, oh, our CEO wants an AI automation that summarizes his email and calendar for the week every Monday morning. It's like, okay, here's a YouTube video and try out Zapier. That's great. That's valuable for them. But like the effort versus value is really not there, versus you've got 10-person sales team, each spending, call it 15 hours a week, generating quotes and proposals for people. That on that effort versus value matrix is up and to the right, probably pretty high. Because especially when salespeople are revenue driving and their time is better spent closing business and forming better relationships and following up with people. So that's how I encourage folks to look at it, is what's the effort versus value. If it's something that you do once a quarter and one person does it for half a day, if it's some sort of, call it quarterly reconciliation, that's probably not worth it, versus something that 5 people are doing every day for 5 hours a day or 5 hours a week even. That adds up pretty quickly. So it's kind of that effort versus value calculation.
I love that we just channeled the Eisenhower matrix in this interview. This is great. So where do you see people forcing AI into steps where it doesn't belong? So if we're going to step back and we're going to think about the Eisenhower matrix and think about your client engagements, I'm sure you've seen this. Where are people forcing it where it just should not be?
Yeah, the complexity of like human decision making is where I see a lot of folks trying to do it. So an analogy that I've come to use with folks when they're overthinking it or trying to over engineer something that should not be is NASA does not hire one rocket scientist to build a rocket. They hire a rocket scientist who builds a team around them, and one person is responsible for the metal on the outside. One person's responsible for the fuel mix in the engines. One, like, I could go on. You get the point of like, there's not one person that does it. And so if you're trying to turn a process that involves 10 people who have to make very nuanced decisions every day or every week into one single AI solution, that's probably a bad place to start, and you're probably going to be disappointed. But if you're looking at it as this rocket scientist has a team of 10 people, well, 2 out of those 10 people probably have something that's pretty rote, pretty repetitive. You could explain in 2 minutes on paper what needs to be done. And yes, maybe it's done 20 times a week at an hour a piece. And so that's the part where we encourage folks to think about adding AI to first. Don't solve for the rocket scientists from day one, solve for the team around them.
Does that also, well, let me back up. That was a perfectly understandable answer. And I'm wondering whether that answer is also an extension of your internal rules for how you decide what stays human versus what belongs with an AI or an automated process.
Yeah,
Yes?
like human in the loop is probably the term that my team is sick of hearing me use. Like I use it in every discussion, it feels like.
Yeah.
Because we're not here to blow smoke or sell people snake oil only to be disappointed by it. Like we want to build stuff we're proud of and that actually works and moves the needle for people. So that's what I'm always saying to my team of like, okay, that's great. Where can this go wrong? Where is the edge case? Where is the human in the loop needed? And so that becomes, I find, usually a pretty easy thing to do if a team sits down with a person, a department, or everyone and says, let's map our process out. You can usually spot pretty quickly the bottlenecks in human decision making, that's what's needed, what's not in that decision making.
With that in mind, and you touched on this subject a little bit earlier in our conversation when you talked about not seeing layoffs, right? So there's a lot of fear mongering out there that AI is going to take jobs. I'm going to put a TBD on that entire conversation, but for right now, we are not seeing that for the most part. What I am interested in hearing from you with your clients, when work does get automated, what actually is happening to the people and to their jobs in your experience?
Yeah, a lot of folks are getting repurposed to, if most businesses have some external stakeholder to their business that makes them successful, freeing up time to spend more time with them. So whether you're selling a product, doing a service, you have users, if you're a technical app, that kind of thing, all of the time freed up that I see is usually spent on investing in those relationships. So how do we retain people as customers or clients for longer? How do we close business faster? How do we support them better? All of the repurposing of roles, because there has been some cases where most business have a never-ending amount of work, so their time is freed up and there's other things now added to their plate to take its place. But for those cases where they're in some sort of role that is connected to an external stakeholder, that time is repurposed and their responsibility becomes, well, your new measurement is your retention of your customers should be higher because you now have more time to spend hearing their needs, solving their challenges, whatever it might be. That's usually where I see a lot of the repurposing from is, what are the external stakeholders to our business and how can we spend more time with them?
I appreciate your frontline perspective on that because it's impossible to, does anybody open a newspaper anymore? It's impossible to look at a digital article or any headline about AI without every second or third one screaming about job layoffs and, this, that, the other thing. And I think it's important to get real information. We've seen the studies that debunk a lot of these headlines, but I think it's important to get that firsthand experience from folks that are out there with clients and sitting and working with folks. And what was behind that question in my mind is when we had talked before, I think you had said to me that fewer than 1 in 20 of your conversations with clients involved the idea of cutting headcount, and the other 19 are more in line with what you're talking about here.
Yeah, like if you sit down with the average exec team, their 5-year roadmap is always full. Like there's never, right. And it always gets pushed out, and their OKRs are never achieved, and their metrics are never exactly where they want them to be. Like we live in a capitalistic society with consumption out the wazoo. Like there is never going to be a shortage of things that we make up to do for ourselves and each other. And so that sounds maybe too esoteric, but point being of like every time we've seen these technical changes, new jobs have come with it. Even if you look at, I think when you ask the average, elementary school student in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they said, I want to be a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer. You ask them today, I want to be a YouTube content creator. I want to be like Mr. Beast. Like these jobs didn't exist 30 years ago. What the hell was YouTube? but now these are the number one most desired jobs of the child who has the world open to them. So that to me is just a very small anecdote that is indicative of how we act as a culture. Of every change has brought new jobs and new ways of working and living, and that creates new jobs, et cetera.
I think that's a fantastic perspective. You said something there that spurred a thought with me too, and I can't remember the exact verbiage you used, but it was basically we're very inventive creatures, right? We're going to continue to invent stuff. And one of the things that I see an awful lot is that people love to invent complexity. They're really bad at simplifying things. And I'm wondering whether you're seeing any ramifications from that with clients that have maybe engaged in some AI pilots or some different work with their folks, because what I have seen is a voluminous amount of new information, right? And I am also seeing in certain instances a lot of complexity that doesn't need to be there as a result of people having access to tools and kind of extending their reach beyond where they should be. Does that resonate with you? You see anything like that?
Well, I think there's two sides to that coin that I often see. One is going back to the cultural change that leaders need to kind of get their
Mm.
teams pointed at, which is a lot of times complexity is born out of, well, we've always done it that way. That is one of my both favorite and least favorite phrases to hear when we get into a new working relationship with the team, where we start to question their process, and we try to come from it as tactfully as possible when it's very obvious that it doesn't make sense. The answer usually is, well, we've always done it that way. And so it's like, well, so you've never questioned your complexity? Like, does it need to be complex? What if it was to be simpler? What would that look like? Oh, I don't know. I never really thought about that, is usually the answer. So just giving people permission to say, like, does something need to be this complex, or have you always just done it this way? And usually the answer to that is, well, yeah, we have always done it that way. We've never really rethought it. On the flip side of the spectrum, the interesting thing to observe is giving teams just a small sliver of AI functionality and wins in their company turns kind of like the Matrix, when at the end he can see the code and it's like, I can see the Matrix. I'm not just in it, I can see it now. When you give them a small slice, they start to see opportunity everywhere, and they go, well, before, when we were going to go after, I'm overusing sales as a motion or an example, but if we're a sales team and we want to go after a certain segment, we didn't have time to do the right research, to have the right conversations with the right people. But now we can. Like, it never felt open to us, because our 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week was always filled to the max with what we already had to do. But now that we can actually have someone, aka AI, I don't mean to humanize it, but now that we can have a thing do a lot of that work for us, this feels like a whole world that is open to us. And now we've got a whole new job to do, because we're getting so much better information that we can have better conversations with quote unquote better people, or more suited people for our business, whatever that might be.
No, that's good. I appreciate the thoughtfulness behind that answer. All right. Time always runs quickly. We've got limited time left here. So let's go back to where we began for maybe our final conversation thread or two here, which is data and my data house being a mess. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of one of our listeners here. I'm a mid-market leader. I'm listening to this. I'm thinking, honestly, I know my data house is a mess. What's the first thing that they need to be doing when they walk in the office the next day?
They should think about what are some of the common pieces of data that span their business. So again, going back to, revenue, operating margin, profitability, even something as simple as our customer name. Let's say you have, in a world in which you have Nike as a client.
In a world, yes.
In a
Sorry.
world where actually Nike is too simple of a name. Most businesses don't work with companies with that popular or simple of a name. But you work with ABC Corp. And so if you go to sales and you go to operations and you go to finance and you go to customer support, like go to all the departments in your business and say, what is your source of truth for our client list? And what is the name of ABC Corp in your system of record? If you don't have the same answer across the board, then you have a data problem. And that problem could be a simple solve. It could be a complex solve. But if there was something that I've encouraged folks to do tomorrow as leaders, is go to your departments and say, what is your source of truth for whatever the data point is? And what does it say for, give them an example. And usually they will find it's almost always a different source of truth. And more often than not, it's a different name for that data point.
I love the simplicity of that. Is there also a test that's that simple that somebody could use to identify their weakest process?
That one's a bit harder. I won't say it's super simple, but again, going to department heads and just saying, could you list out all the processes that your team have in the next 24 hours? And if they can't, then that probably means they haven't. Like a good, not a good team, because I don't want to knock people who haven't defined their process and mapped it out. That's not a lot of people's jobs to do all day. But as a leader of a department, if you have no idea how the department functions beyond, well, we've always done it that way, and we have a tribal or a institutional knowledge with each other, and it's not written down anywhere, then how can you apply AI to it? Like, what are you going to give to AI to explain how it should do the process that you're asking it to do that a human did before? And so a quick, litmus test is, could you provide me written documentation or a workflow map or any sort of documentation of how the process in your department runs within 24 hours? And if they say, no, I'd have to create it, then that's step one. You should probably create it, because when we come in, that's what we're going to do. So
Right.
Any company that they work with externally as a consultant is going to want to do that, because we all know, working with AI every day, you can't just say, we're not there yet, at least, where read those people's minds and figure out how it works.
Yeah, not quite yet. Not quite yet. All right. I'm always hesitant to ask future casting questions, but I've got kind of a two-parter here for you as we wrap up. What is something that you've been most surprised by in the last 3 to 6 months with AI? Has anything come across your desk that you didn't anticipate?
As much as I expected the models to get better, I did not expect them to get better this fast. Like, it always is painful to hear when someone's like, oh, AI is crap. And then you ask them, how have you used it? Well, I signed up for ChatGPT a year ago, and it felt like a glorified Google. I'm like, yeah, that's fair, a year ago. I don't think you've realized what has changed in the last year. So the surprising thing is just how quickly they have advanced. And by that, I mean, its ability, Fable from Anthropic is a good recent example of, you used to just give it something as a request, whatever that prompt might have been, as simple or complex as it might have been, and it usually just did the thing you asked. And either it did it right and you were happy with it, or more often than not, it didn't do it right because it didn't understand the nuance. It didn't think, what's the edge cases? What's the things that could go wrong? What are the things I don't know? And now when you ask Fable that kind of stuff, it is wild to see where you can open up the thinking reasoning that it's doing, and you can see, well, but if I do this, then that would be impacted. But if I don't do this, then they wouldn't know that it wasn't done. Like, its ability to think outside the box, so to speak, is impressive. If I were I'm trying to think of like just one word that isn't too hypey, but like it's very impressive.
And I think that's a good spin into the last question, which is, again, that future casting. It is very difficult for us as humans, I think, to understand the implications of an exponentially increasing technology. And we haven't plateaued yet, right? That's kind of what you're talking about with your recent comments here and the improvements in the models. What do you expect we're going to see, either in terms of models or functionalities or breakthroughs? What are you thinking we may see in the next 6 to 8 months? We're recording this midway through 2026, so we got half a year left. What do you think?
I think the models themselves are going to continue to get better in the same ways they've gotten better, as in they are better at reasoning, they are better at understanding what you really mean if you give it something vague, that kind of thing. What I think we'll see the most advancement is the infrastructure around the models. And by that, I mean the memory and the context and the ability to connect them to multiple things at once. Right now, most of the companies are competing for lock-in, as in, we want you to use only our platform and only the way that we set it up for you. Because of the open source movement around AI models and whatnot, and just the kind of like in the cloud era when AWS became a big thing, all AWS is really infrastructure around a bunch of data centers and networking devices. They just built really good infrastructure that propelled them quickly. I think we're going to see the same thing over the next little while with AI, and what benefit that provides to people who are listening, beyond just the like nerdy technical cool stuff happening, is you don't have to re-explain the same thing every time you start a new chat session. You don't have to spend a ton of time connecting different sources and having it understand the nuance of, well, I've got revenue data over here and operating cost data over here and employee data over here, and I have to tell it how to think about all that. Like, the models are getting so good and the infrastructure around it is getting so good that it understands, well, this business revenue model plus their operating model plus their staff cost means XYZ for next year's budget. And that infrastructure is what makes this more useful. And so I think the big shifts that we're seeing already right now is the infrastructure is becoming a lot more mature really quickly, which is what really matters.
Yeah. I think that's as excellent of a future cast as I've heard. So, Justin, I have tremendously enjoyed our time together today. This was a fantastic conversation. If folks that didn't have the privilege of having a microphone in front of them are listening in and they want to get in touch with you for a conversation, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, feel free to check out what we do at withswitchboard.com. And if you search me up on LinkedIn, Justin Watt, W-A-T-T, and I think it's just LinkedIn/Watt Justin, name backwards. If anyone had any specific questions or wanted to go further down any of these rabbit holes that we've started today, then feel free to reach out.
And they are many and varied. You could trip, break an ankle, or sink your entire leg down those rabbit holes. So, Justin, again, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time today.
Goes both ways. Thanks for having me, Chad.
And thank you to our listeners for once again tuning in to AI for the C-Suite. If you liked what you heard, subscribe wherever you get your pod on, follow us on LinkedIn, and check out AIforthec-suite.com. And until next time, keep your algorithms running, your leadership evolving, and your AI in check.